What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL playoffs, wild card weekend, Saturday games, final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL playoffs. Let's take a look at this 2-game Saturday slate. So at the quarterback position, I like Justin Herbert from the LA Chargers playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Justin Herbert has averaged 18.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 3.2 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 41% owned, projected at 17.7 fantasy points here this week. He is $6,600 DraftKings salary, $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Chargers favored by 2. So Justin Herbert has scored 19, 17, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 2, 1, and 5 rush attempts in those games. So he's going to be without Mike Williams, who suffered a fracture, who's going to be out for 2 to 3 weeks, but he's still got plenty of weapons. It's a good matchup, and I just think he's got the highest ceiling on the slate. So I like Justin Herbert here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, if you want to save some salary at the quarterback position, even though he doesn't have a good matchup, take a look at Geno Smith from the Seattle Seahawks playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing quarterbacks, but Geno Smith has averaged 19.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 4 rush attempts per game. Only going to be about 13% owned. So it looks like he's the quarterback sleeper pick with the lowest ownership. Projected at 19.4 fantasy points here this week. Has the highest projection. And he's only $5,600 DraftKings salary. $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the Seahawks trailing by 9.5. So a good passing game script, and Geno Smith has scored 16, 17, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He had 4, 5, and 3 rush attempts in those games. So not a good matchup here, but everything else is looking good. So I like Geno Smith here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So one of the studs on the slate is Christian McCaffrey from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 8th worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Christian McCaffrey has averaged 21.8 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 14.4 rush attempts per game, 6.4 pass targets per game, been on the field for 75% of the snaps, gonna be about 66% owned, projected at 22.7 fantasy points here this week. He's $8,500 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 9.5. So potential running game script in this game, in a good matchup, and Christian McCaffrey has scored 17, 34, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 10, 19, and 15 rush attempts in those games, on top of 3, 9, and 2 pass targets. So only 13 touches last week, but remember these last couple of weeks for teams that have had their playoff seed locked up, the starters haven't got the volume that they're used to throughout the season. That will change in the playoffs. The studs are going to get the majority of the carries and the targets here. So I like Christian McCaffrey here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, coming down in salary here, I like Travis Etienne from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the LA Chargers, who have the middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Travis Etienne has averaged 13.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.9 rush attempts per game, 2.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 48% owned, projected at 12.2 fantasy points here today. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars trailing by 2. So Travis Etienne has scored 5, 26, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 7, 9, and 22 rush attempts in those games, on top of 2, 3, and 3 pass targets. So I'm expecting Travis Etienne to get 20 touches or more in this game. It's a great matchup. He's got a pretty big ceiling in this game here. Probably my favorite running back on the slate when you consider salary. So I like Travis Etienne here versus the LA Chargers. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway, and the winner is Craig Hartle. Congratulations, Craig Hartle. You are the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So my favorite wide receiver on the slate, especially with Mike Williams out, is Keenan Allen from the LA Chargers playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Keenan Allen has averaged 17.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 55% owned, projected at 20.5 fantasy points here tonight, and he's 7,000 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Chargers favored by 2. So Keenan Allen has scored 33, 12, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 11, 6, and 14 pass targets. So I like Keenan Allen here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now coming down in salary, I like DK Metcalf from the Seattle Seahawks playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have the best defense overall, but they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DK Metcalf has averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.3 pass targets per game. On the field for 82% of the snaps, going to be about 22% owned, projected at 14.2 fantasy points here this week. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, and they have the Seahawks trailing by 9.5. So DK Metcalf has scored 7, 1, and 15 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 5, and 9 pass targets. Now, pretty good wide receiver matchup here. And everything else looks good. This could be a passing game script. He could get a ton of pass targets in this game. So I like DK Metcalf here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Now I also like Tyler Lockett from the Seattle Seahawks. He's averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.3 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 73% of the snaps. He's going to be about 27% owned, projected at 15.9 fantasy points here this week. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel, and Tyler Lockett has scored 15 and 4 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 7 and 2 pass targets. So I like Tyler Lockett here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Now, coming down in salary here, you got a guy that's got a pretty big ceiling with a low price tag because he's been out throughout the season, came back last week, had 3 pass targets and 1 rush attempt. So a little bit of a gamble here, but I think he's worth it. Take a look at Deebo Samuel from the San Francisco 49ers, playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 6th worst defense overall. Been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, but Deebo Samuel has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game and 3.2 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 36% owned, projected at 13.3 fantasy points here this week. He's 5,700 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 9.5. Now, Deebo Samuel, he's been out with injury, but he came back last week, scored 4 fantasy points off of 3 rush attempts and 1 pass target. We'll see what kind of volume he gets in this first game of the playoffs. I think his price tag is low enough that will justify this play because he's got some major upside. If he can get 7 to 10 touches this game, shouldn't have a problem hitting value here. Some people might be cautious and wait a week, but that's the risk to reward. So I like Deebo Samuel here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Okay, now coming way down in salary here, if you're looking for a sleeper pick and a value play, take a look at Marvin Jones Jr. from the Jacksonville Jaguars, playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they've been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers. Marvin Jones Jr. has averaged 7.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.1 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 17% owned, projected at 7.4 fantasy points here on Saturday. He's 3,400 DraftKings salary, 2,100 more on FanDuel. So I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars trailing by 2. So Marvin Jones Jr. has scored 5, 12, and 5 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 7, and 4 pass targets. So pretty good volume for such a low price tag. So I like Marvin Jones Jr. as a value play here versus the LA Chargers. Now there's two other wide receivers on the slate that I think are interesting. Take a look at Christian Kirk from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, have been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, but Christian Kirk has averaged 14.8 fantasy points per game on the season.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Getting an average of 7.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 88% of the snaps, going to be about 35% owned. Projected at 14.4 fantasy points here this week. He's $5,900 DraftKings salary, $1,600 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars trailing by 2. Christian Kirk has scored 22, 4, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 8, 3, and 6 pass targets in those games. So I like Christian Kirk here versus the LA Chargers. Okay, and the last wide receiver that I think is interesting here, well, there's a couple other guys, but I guess the last 3 that I like, I'll just give you to them all at once here. You got Brandon Ayuk from the San Francisco 49ers, averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 92% of the snaps, going to be about 21% owned, projected at 13.7 fantasy points here this week. He's $5,800 DraftKings salary, $900 more on FanDuel. Brandon Ayuk has scored 10, 30, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 12, and 7 pass targets. So I like Brandon Ayuk here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now you could also consider Joshua Palmer from the LA Chargers or Zay Jones from the Jacksonville Jaguars. Joshua Palmer going to be about 39% owned, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game, while projected at 16.3 fantasy points here this week. So with Mike Williams out, Joshua Palmer's point projection has gone way up here. He's only $5,300 DraftKings salary, $1,200 more on FanDuel. He scored 10 fantasy points last game off of 6 pass targets. So with Mike Williams out, this becomes a pretty good play here if you want to save some salary. So I like Joshua Palmer here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, another low salary wide receiver you could consider is Zay Jones from the Jacksonville Jaguars, averaging 12.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.6 pass targets per game. Going to be about 45% owned, projected at 12.2 fantasy points here this week. He's $4,300 DraftKings salary, $2,000 more on FanDuel. And Zay Jones has scored 6, 5, and 2 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 5, and 4 pass targets. So not my favorite value play, but at $4,300, getting an average of 7.6 pass targets per game, I guess he makes sense here. So I like Zay Jones as a value play here versus the LA Chargers. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. Take a look at George Kittle from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 8th worst defense overall, give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. George Kittle has averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.7 pass targets per game. On the field for 79% of the snaps, going to be about 29% owned, projected at 14.7 fantasy points here tonight. He's $5,900 DraftKings salary, $1,800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game. They have the 49ers favored by 9.5. And Brock Purdy has loved himself some George Kittle, who scored 19, 12, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 8, and 8 pass targets. So with a fantastic matchup here, I like George Kittle here versus the Seattle Seahawks. I also like Evan Ingram from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Evan Ingram has averaged 12.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 77% of the snaps, going to be about 37% owned, projected at 10.1 fantasy points here tonight. He's $4,200 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. And Evan Ingram has scored 7, 4, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 4, 2, and 8 pass targets. Excuse me, my voice is cutting out here. So I like Evan Ingram here versus the LA Chargers. Okay, let's see if we can finish this off here. And this is He's propelled himself into a pretty good value play here with Mike Williams out. So I like Jared Everett from the LA Chargers playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Gerald Everett has averaged 8.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.4 pass targets per game. Going to be about 33% owned, projected at 11.5 fantasy points here this week. He's only $3,800 DraftKings salary, $1,700 more on FanDuel. And Gerald Everett has scored 10 and 11 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 5 and 3 pass targets. Could get some extra pass targets here with Mike Williams out. So I like Gerald Everett here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.